So today I'll be talking about the Harmony Codex, the new album by Steven Wilson. As you probably expected I might be, because this is a very high-profile release that's gathered a lot of attention. As always, I'm Hans from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We are a contemporary art rock project, one of the many, many bands that's been inspired by Wilson's example to blend progressive rock with other aspects of contemporary music to make something that is artistically ambitious but approachable, not hidebound by tradition. Check out one of our album playlists right here on YouTube, or look us up on Bandcamp or your favorite streaming service. Now, Wilson, I'm sure, needs no introduction at all for people who are going to be watching this channel. He's a figure who's come to define contemporary progressive rock while also trying to shed the limits of that genre tag. Now, many of the artists that I talk about on this channel are underdogs, right? People who've never quite gotten their due, like, Camel, Caravan, Peter Hamel. Artists who spend decades really struggling just to exist, and where that struggle to exist is part of the story of the work, and really something that you need to understand to even really get why the work is the way that it is. Wilson, for lack of a better word, is an overdog, right? He's a benchmark for success in the world of people who buy everything that's released on Kscope. And of course, in Wilson's case, that success is accentuated by the work that he's done remixing classic albums by bands like Yes and Jethro Tull, right? So you kind of get the eerie feeling that he's got his tentacles not just in the present of progressive rock and probably also its future, but at the same time somehow in its past too. And Wilson's been one of the very few people in the world of contemporary prog who's been prominent enough for long enough that you could actually call him overexposed, right? He has enough venues for the expression of his thoughts and ideas that people can actually sometimes hear them and be annoyed by them. He often seems disappointed by the reception of his work in ways which I think are totally reasonable from his perspective, but maybe maddening from the perspective of all the people who are, seeing him exist at a pinnacle that almost no one else could ever hope to reach. So what that all means, I think, is that there's a high psychological burden attached to the experience of listening to something of his. It's difficult to approach it on its own terms. Everything he does now brings with it the curse of high expectations at a level that's pretty much unique to him. And beyond all the issues I've already mentioned, there's also the fact that this album is coming at a time when there's been some perception of decline in the arc of his catalog, probably by me as much as anybody. His fourth solo album, Hand Cannot Erase, was one of the best concept albums of the last 30 years. It was technically sophisticated, it was emotionally rich, it was narratively cohesive while still allowing individual songs to work on their own terms. The follow-up to The Bone tried to position itself as a successor to progressive pop albums like So and Hounds of Love and Color of Spring. It was an intriguing idea, and the album certainly has its adherents, but I didn't necessarily feel like all of the material connected as well as the kind of idea of the style did. And, the larger response to it, I think, was somewhat mixed, although it certainly does have some very strong adherents and enthusiastic fans. And then his sixth solo album, The Future Bites, was a diversion into synthpop, which, as far as I can tell, seems to have alienated a large part of his audience, while also totally failing to expand his profile far beyond, people who are still mad that Steve Hackett left Genesis. So, now that we've established the stakes for this release, what are my thoughts on the album? Well, having lived with it for a few days, I really like it. It feels like an attempt to integrate every style, every approach, every technique he's used as a solo artist or just as a musician overall into one coherent whole, right? To make an argument for the unity of his body of work by taking aspects of everything that he's done, including even, the techno albums that he released as Bass Communion, and blending those together into something unified and consistent. I don't know how much Wilson was deliberately attempting to do that, but that does seem like the kind of thing he would consciously think about doing. And if that was the goal, it really succeeds about as well as I can imagine, which is particularly impressive for it being such an ambitious goal. The first two songs here lay that lay that idea out, lay out the scope of things very clearly, right? Inclination begins with a synth loop that feels almost more drawn from industrial than the electropop of Future Bites. You know, it feels like a somewhat less abrasive version of what you might hear on like a Skinny Puppy or Nine Inch Nails album, you know, where pure noise is sculpted into a musical texture. But it's topped with a searching, evocative solo on, you know, what's either, I think, a keyboard or some kind of non-Western instrument being fed through effects. The result is something which has both a very carefully crafted sonic texture and organic humanity in the playing. And then the second track, What Life Brings, is built around strummed acoustic guitar, live drums, in a way which feels, you know, pretty closely connected to the kind of post-Floydian progressive rock tradition. So the sonic scope just of those two pieces, I think, makes it immediately clear that this isn't just going to be a synth pop album or a prog album. It's not just going to be something built out of electronics and programming, but it's not just going to be something built out of pure musicianship. It's drawing from, but not defined by either of those approaches. And as the album advances, you know, you have a dizzying range of sounds and moods that it passes through. All kinds of synthesizers, all kinds of electronics, live strings, live choirs, really lush backing vocals, intricate keyboard solos, very creative and propulsive drum loops mixed with what sounds like very good live drumming. No one element or approach dominates, but at the same time, it doesn't feel hyperactive or crowded, right? Every sound is given room to breathe and develop. And the structures of the songs vary in a really effective way. You know, you have some relatively straightforward verse-chorus pieces. You have a long song built around a sequence of movements in a way that feels very classically prog rock. You have an almost ambient, synth-like, dreamy piece topped with surreal narration. So the sound, the style, the complexity of the playing, the length of the songs, the intricacy of the writing, you know, these things ebb and flow according to the requirements of the moment in a really well-balanced way. I think if anything is missing, it's the heavy kind of quasi-metal guitar riffs that intermittently pop up in Porcupine Tree, starting with the album In Absentia, and a little bit on the solo albums too. There's really none of that here. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure there's any distorted guitar at all, but honestly, you know, the metally bits always felt like the weakest parts of those old Porcupine Tree albums. They feel like something that's there for punctuation or to kind of break up the other pieces, but they don't really contain much interesting musical content on their own. Frankly, I think, you know, to my ears, their absence is unlamented. But what ties all this together is the sensitivity of how all these things are blended and arranged. You know, there aren't jarring contrasts between sections or whiplash changes in tempo or volume or sound. Obviously, at this point, he has the sensitivity as a producer and a mixer to allow all this to hold itself together and to ebb and flow in a balanced way. The other thing tying it all together is Wilson's presence as a singer, his way of writing vocal melodies. In his book, limited edition of one, he's quite critical of his own voice, but you know, he's always had a lovely tone as a singer. He's always been able to write moving and affecting melodic lines, which convey a sense of sort of overcast melancholy. His voice has always lent itself incredibly well to being stacked in layers of harmony. So the result is something that feels like the first thing he's done in quite a long time that is not consciously indebted to something else. You know, he's not putting fences around things where he says, here's a prog rock album like Raven That Refused to Sing. Here's an electropop album like The Future Bites. Instead, he's allowing stylistic elements to serve the overall creative vision instead of building the vision around a stylistic approach. And I'm actually going to say that again because I think that's the core of what makes this album work. It's kind of the key thesis of this video. He's allowing the stylistic elements to serve the overall creative vision instead of building the vision around a stylistic approach. That, I think, is what makes this infinitely more successful than The Future Bites. And really what sets it apart, I think, maybe from almost everything that he's done in his solo career. Now, ostensibly, this is a concept album based on a short story by the same name, which appeared in limited edition of one. I'll admit here that I don't get much of a sense of conceptual arc from the lyrics, right? There are a couple of sections of spoken word which are adapted from that story, and those are quite evocative. I really like them when they appear. The rest of the album, having read the story a couple times and listened to the album a few times, I don't really get a sense of much of a direct connection between those things. And it certainly doesn't seem like the album is just literally a setting of the events of that story. Maybe if I studied the booklet, I'd have a clearer sense of kind of some conceptual arc. But, a good concept album, I think, should be intelligible without that kind of extra textual material. This doesn't have that quality. In general, the lyrics are mostly just there. There's nothing as hackneyed as the worst writing on closure continuation. There's nothing as creative and moving as the best lines in Hand Cannot Erase. Maybe there are things in the lyrics I'm missing that will show up in time. That's certainly possible. It might be that I've been too distracted by the soundscaping and arranging and melodic qualities to pay the attention I normally would to the lyrics, but, maybe. But I think the quality of that soundscaping, of that sonic expressiveness, really kind of makes up for the absence of a distinct lyrical vision. Now, I'm a big fan of The Album Years, the podcast that Wilson does with Tim Bowness, and one thing Wilson and Bowness talk about a lot is appreciating an artist's whole catalog, enjoying an album in terms of how it fits into that larger narrative. Oddities, digressions, lesser works, things that weren't received well at the time, those are stops in the larger journey of an artist or a band, and they're always easier to appreciate within the scope of the whole body of work. In a way, I think that this album actually fixes the long-term meaning of the Future Bites, in that, depending how this album turned out, Future Bites could either be remembered retroactively as a daring experiment that broadened the range of what Wilson could do, or as kind of a jump the shark moment where his catalog really started to go off the rails. And the quality of Harmony Codex, in a way, I think retroactively gives Future Bites kind of a John the Baptist quality, where it allows Wilson to broaden his palette, expand his canvas, develop the tools, introduce the ideas and the capacities that allowed him to make something like this, to pave the way for something like this. This album kind of makes me like the Future Bites more retroactively, because it does mean that album signaled not, a dead end or a real kind of going off the rails quality, but instead the transition to something that is, I think, actually ultimately more stylistically creative, more broad, more varied, while still retaining everything that made his previous work effective. I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of positive press for this album. I think a lot of fans are going to really like it. I haven't actually talked to anybody else about it or read any other reviews. I wanted to go into it blind, so I don't really know what people are saying about it, but I have a feeling it'll be quite well received. I wish I had a more contrarian view, something a little more surprising to say, but I think it's really quite good in a pretty undeniable way. Thanks for listening, and I'll see everybody next week.